Have you ever embellished a personal story to make it seem more interesting or impressive? I'm fairly certain we all have. But what if someone retold your story as fact and added their own extra details? Over time, as the story is repeated again and again, it takes on the air of authenticity and eventually becomes a myth. Today we are talking with Kevin Levin, historian and author of a book focusing on a significant myth surrounding the Civil War. This is Too Complicated for History. On today's episode, we're talking to Kevin Levin, who is an educator and historian and author, and we'll be talking about his book, Searching for Black Confederates, the Civil War's Most Persistent Myth. Thanks for being here with us today.
Great to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
So we want to start out by talking about, your book was fantastic. I really enjoyed your book. And so before we actually go into what's in the book and what you dismantle, I was wondering if you could talk to us about the myth that you're talking about. You say it's the most persistent myth of the Civil War. So can you explain first what that myth is?
Yeah, so the myth of the Black Confederate goes something like this, that anywhere between roughly 500 and 100,000 African Americans, whether they be enslaved or free, fought as soldiers, enlisted soldiers in the Confederate Army between 1861 and 1865. And
that's a big gap.
It is a big gap. And that is one of the first problems that people should notice with this narrative. But it's a narrative that lives almost entirely online on hundreds, if not thousands, of websites that have appeared over the last few decades. And so maybe we can talk about sort of that aspect of the myth, but its connection to the popularity of the internet as a place where people now consume history is a big part of this story.
That's fantastic because I think that's true of a lot of history. I personally, I look for a lot of primary sources online, and I find a lot of secondary sources that are kind of baffling. I think, Isaac, you've had the same experience.
The internet's usually a good starting point, but the most important part of any of those articles is always the reference list somewhere. Hopefully there is one, for those secondary sources.
It's a huge problem for all of us who engage in some form of public education, public history. If we're teaching in the classroom, our students, the public generally, they get their information from websites online, right? The internet. And most of us don't think at all about sort of what search terms we're plugging into our preferred search engine. And we're certainly not thinking about the results that come up as a result. We're just clicking on the top link and we just assume that Google ranks, their websites based on their truth value. And of course, we know that that's not true. And so this sort of social or digital media illiteracy is really problematic, not just, in terms of how we think and consume history, but just questions about citizenship, right? How we consume news, how we consume information, and whether or not we can agree on the basic facts, right?
Right. It's like the Abraham Lincoln quote, don't believe everything you read on the internet.
Well said.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
Nailed it. Internet.
Nailed it. Exactly.
So to talk about that myth, you actually quantify it. You give it considering it the most prevalent myth about the Civil War. That's pretty. At least I consider that a pretty big statement because there's I think quite a few myths about the Civil War that are sort of putzing around. Why is this one the most prevalent and in your view, like the most significant?
I think because it certainly in the end relates to a fundamental misunderstanding about the Civil War, and that is the place of slavery in our understanding of the Civil War. And I think for a long time, I think the popular view of the Civil War was that it was caused by a disagreement over the Constitution, right? The so-called states' rights view of the cause of the Civil War. And the Black Confederate myth, the modern version, is sort of an extension of this long history of avoiding that issue. The question about slavery's importance. Because, of course, the argument goes for people who believe this, if, in fact, a significant number of Black men fought as soldiers in the Confederate Army, then it makes no sense to argue that the Confederacy was fighting to maintain slavery and white supremacy. And so if you think about slavery or just the misunderstanding of slavery's importance as the fundamental misunderstanding or myth about the war, the Black Confederate narrative is certainly an outgrowth of that. So it's sort of right there at the center of this myth about the war that was, sort of propagated right after the beginning, or right at the end of the war and into the post-war period, this lost cause belief that the Confederacy wasn't fighting to preserve the institution of slavery.
Right. So when you're talking about these soldiers, are you talking about these perceived soldiers? Were they enslaved men or were they free men or were they both?
Yeah. And so, it leads to one of the two important goals that I have for the book, which was, on the one hand, to dismantle the myth and sort of to untangle it, why it's so popular today. The second was to actually talk about the way in which enslaved labor functioned in the Confederate Army. And so the first two chapters of the book are really about the war itself and the Confederate Army, the identity, if you will, of the Confederate Army, or racial profile of the Confederate Army. And, if you're looking at, say, Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, in the summer of 1863, an army that numbered somewhere around 75,000 as it's marching north into Maryland, into Pennsylvania, culminating in the Battle of Gettysburg at the beginning of July of 63. There may have been as many as 10,000 enslaved men with that army. And there would have been thousands of, for what people would have called for a long time, body servants, personal slaves of mainly Confederate officers from the slaveholding class. And then there would have been thousands of impressed laborers. These are enslaved men that are impressed from their owners and forced to work in different departments of the Confederate Army. And so I wanted to, I focused mainly on the body servants, or what I call camp slaves, in the book. And I really wanted to try to understand what their role was and why we can't understand the Confederate Army in terms of how well it functioned, how the battles and campaigns unfolded, without actually coming to terms with the fact that these armies operated on the backs of enslaved workers, right? Mainly those body servants who are an extension of their master's service. They're not part of the Confederate Army in any legitimate way. They're not part of the hierarchy of the military. They are owned, right? They are legal extensions of their masters, but they're still there in camp. They're still making it possible for their owners to do what they need to do as officers of companies, of regiments, and even into the brigade and division level. And so they're an integral part of that structure. And so, we talk about slavery often in the abstract when it comes to the Civil War, that the South, where the Confederacy was fighting to maintain this institution. Oftentimes people want to draw a distinction between that and their great-great-grandparents, who they want to argue may not have owned slaves, was not fighting in the army to preserve slavery, or the army generally wasn't, we don't have to worry about slavery when talking about battles and campaigns. And one of the things I wanted to do with these first two chapters was to say that distinction is untenable, that we have to understand what Alexander Stephens described, the vice president in 1861, as the cornerstone of the Confederacy, slavery as that cornerstone. It was the cornerstone in an abstract sense and in a very real sense. especially in the Army. So if you're a Confederate soldier who didn't own any slaves, standing next to someone who owned 100 slaves, both of you understood the importance of enslaved labor in that army. You woke up to it every day. You could see it everywhere, in camp, on the march, and even on the battlefield. So it's absolutely vital, I think, to acknowledge their presence.
That's interesting because I even when you don't see, especially in popular history, a lot of consideration for the support systems that are necessary for armies to
That's right.
Conduct the campaigns that they're doing. I mean, which is something that in a modern sense, we very much understand that, for every fighter jet every pilot, there's like dozens of people on the ground that are supporting that one unit that is actually going out and fighting. But you're saying that was true even of the Confederate Army or both the armies during the Civil War.
That means working in hospitals. That means functioning as teamsters, driving wagons, ensuring that supply lines are maintained. Anything that the Army needs to function, enslaved labor does that work. And that's important. That's absolutely, crucial for the Confederacy because, of course, the Confederacy is operating under a lot of constraints. The most obvious one is just sheer population. The population of the white South, the total population of the South in 61 is 9 million. Half that population is enslaved. The population of the North is roughly 19 million. So just in terms of sheer manpower, how many white men of military age you're going to be able to mobilize? The Confederacy, of course, has a huge disadvantage. And so the more work that could be done by enslaved labor, the more white men can shoulder a rifle in the Army. And so not just in the Army, at munitions factories like the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, enslaved labor is doing that work, maintaining and constructing rail lines throughout the Confederacy. A lot of that work was done by enslaved labor. And of course, constructing earthworks around cities like Richmond, outside of Charleston, South Carolina, as defense. That work is all being done by enslaved labor. And that I think we've known for a long time. Historians have written about this, but the Army has, I think, for a lot of historians and especially for the general public, or what you might call Civil War buffs, it's escaped our attention, and I think it's hugely problematic, especially if you visit battlefields. You visit a place like Gettysburg, and it's easy to get sort of sucked up into this, following the regiments, following the ebb and flow of battle, and losing sight of the larger issues that were at play in these battles, right? What was it all for? Why does it matter that one side won a particular battle? When Lee's army goes into Pennsylvania in the summer of 63, Pennsylvania was a free state. That means Robert E. Lee brought the institution of slavery into the free state of Pennsylvania during the Civil War. How does that fact shift or enrich how we understand the importance of that campaign and its outcome?
And you said that army, was it 70, around 75,000 total?
Around 75,000, yeah.
And over 10,000 enslaved?
At least. And that means that, I think it's safe to say that we're talking about an army of slaves, right? And
that's an enormous percentage.
It is enormous. And, we get glimpses of what, that army would have looked like as it's marching north, because I came across a number of accounts from officers who had body servants or camp slaves with them. And a number of them talk about at the end of each regiment as they're marching, all of the camp slaves or body servants within that regiment would have been marching together, right? And we know that some of these enslaved men wore uniforms. Either they were supplied by their masters or in some cases were purchased with the money they may have earned on free time during camp when they're encamped. And so you have to imagine, for some people, looking at a Confederate army and seeing perhaps at the end of a regiment, maybe seeing 30 to 50 black men marching, some of them holding the weapons of their masters and others, right? That would have been quite a sight. And it's easy to see how some of these stories early on end up getting sort of manipulated, right? Or misunderstood as evidence of the Confederacy utilizing black soldiers during the war itself.
So sorry for the interruption, but we're going to take a brief break now for a word from our sponsors.
Now, was that data as far as how many people were involved and what percentage of the army was enslaved easy to find? Or just to get really at the core of like where this misunderstanding comes from? Like, was it just sitting there and just no one was looking at it, or were you toiling through?
Admit, I did not crunch the numbers myself. I relied on a couple of studies from historians who have sort of looked at different aspects of the structure of these armies and sort of estimating, what a regiment would have looked like in terms of the number of enslaved men attached to it, right? And then sort of calculating out from that, right? And also, I think sort of other factors. So certainly during the end of the war, there were likely, the number would have been significantly smaller as the armies are suffering from increased desertion, as enslaved men are taking more of an opportunity to run off when they're in close proximity to the United States Army. So, you have to sort of take into account a range of factors. Part of the problem is a lot of these records just didn't survive. So, you have to sort of rely on what's available.
Well, to jump off of Isaac's question, it's really cool the way you deal with sources in your book. So you talk about, of course, the images, the photographs of, you see these African Americans in Confederate uniforms, and people, you say on the internet, people have used this to prove that they were, in fact, soldiers, as well as, I know, pensions. You say, well, people, they got pensions, so clearly they were soldiers. So can you talk a little bit about your sources that you engaged?
I tried to use the sources. Well, first, I should say, I made a conscious effort to use sources that in many cases are accessible to people, that you can access online. Because one of the things, I knew I was going to be criticized for is, as a historian, as someone sort of engaged in this particular subject or researching this particular subject, it's easy to be dismissed. It's easy to be dismissed as sort of another academic or left-leaning, whatever. You know the drill. And I just wanted to, be able to say, well, take a look for yourself. Right. And I also wanted to use primary source material as a kind of object lesson to say, look, this is how I went through interpreting this material, right? And you may not agree with me. Here's the material. Go at it. And, if you really want to engage in a serious discussion with me about this stuff, try to interpret it on your own. Of course, the problem, I think, in this case is that many people just simply don't know how to do that. Now, I'm not saying that as someone, I don't have a PhD in history. I have a master's degree. But I've certainly sort of done the legwork. I've spent, my time, thinking about this stuff, reading other historians, et cetera. And I think, at some point we do need to acknowledge that thinking historically is a skill, and it takes practice. It takes falling on your face a number of times and getting it wrong. To be able to begin to sort of fashion something that is going to convince other people, right? Who bring a critical perspective to their own reading of your work. And I think a lot of people just simply aren't aware of that. And so you can just take the cover of my book, that famous photograph of Silas and Andrew Chandler, where they're sitting both in uniform, appear to be heavily armed. I mean, who wouldn't think that what they're looking at are two bona fide Confederate soldiers? But you have, as we all know, you have to have the right questions to ask. You have to be able to bring in context. You have to be able to critically evaluate the primary source material itself, right? And only then can you even begin to start, fashioning an interpretation. And so a lot of that source material, I was pulling off websites just to say, okay, here it is. Let's look at it with a new perspective. Here's
you can
the
find
context.
a lot of really cool primary sources online. I mean, Ancestry. Some of the Library of Congress has photographs of tons of primary sources.
Absolutely. And so it's not just the websites of individuals who have decided that what they're looking at are, is proof of Black Confederate soldiers. Those institutions are absolutely vital in this work. But again, I think getting back to the start of our conversation, it also creates a kind of tension because on the one hand, everyone can be their own historian, right? And so there's something valuable about that. And at the same time, it's also on the internet, the Wild West. There are no gatekeepers. Everyone's view has, equal validity, if you will, right?
Yep.
I mean, the pensions are really interesting. I was just going to say one more thing. The pensions are a really interesting example because in many cases, most people, at least people that I've talked to, have never even seen the pensions. A lot of the pensions actually say on them, these are pensions for former slaves. They draw a very clear distinction between former slaves and soldiers.
Right.
Right? It's mind-boggling.
But if you don't see them, you don't see that one sentence. And so you can assume. Right.
Exactly. Sorry, Isaac, I cut you off there.
No. That's a great point. That you're not actually, because I would say that the accessibility of those things provides a unique challenge because you brought it up that those being the most accessible are probably the most misinterpreted.
That's right.
That famous image is the most misunderstood because it's been seen so many times, because it's been
and
looked at so
I
many
should
times.
Say, I was going to say that the great-great-granddaughter of the man in that image contacted me. Must have been 12 years ago. And this is a woman who had long been trying to combat this myth in their own family cemetery where he's buried, where the sons of Confederate veterans continue to place a sort of the equivalent of a Medal of Honor, Confederate, Medal of Honor, in front of his grave, honoring him or recognizing him as a soldier. And when I first met her online, I could sense the frustration because she had done the work. She knew that this was largely a myth, and it doesn't matter, right? It's who tells the best story. It's whether or not your website ranks high on the search engines. Who has the influence? Who's telling the story? Right, matters.
Right.
Yeah. So to get back to the source of that story. So when did this stuff? You said it started. The myth started to be sort of like coalesce right at the end of, or as early as the end of the war. That's when
So I want to draw a distinction here because certainly during the war, for political purposes. People like Frederick Douglass, right, the great black abolitionist, who have been pushing for the recruitment of African Americans from day one. He has a newspaper. He's operating a newspaper. Other people who are also pushing for black recruitment are using some of the early stories during the war. People who believe that what they were looking at were black soldiers in Confederate camps, Confederate earthworks, were publicizing these stories to convince the Republican administration, the Lincoln administration in Washington, hey, the Confederacy is utilizing African Americans, utilizing their enslaved labor. If you don't pass a similar policy, we're going to use that potential pool of labor, of possible soldiers.
Right.
And so you better do it, right? So they are manipulating those stories. Many of them are secondhand, right? Douglass never observes them himself. They're just sort of picking and choosing these stories from the front and using them for political purposes. At no point does Douglass, or really anyone else that I can think of right now, ever sort of suggest that there were tens of thousands. It's just that these individual accounts were useful. Now, interesting, when these stories get printed in Northern newspapers, especially in 1862, early 1863, Confederates went out of their way to deny this. When they would hear about these or read Northern newspapers, they would get incredibly frustrated because, of course, they understood what they were fighting for. They were fighting, of course, to maintain slavery. They were fighting to maintain a white republic. And the idea of black men fighting as citizen soldiers in their army is just outrageous to them, right? This is what they're fighting to prevent, the arming of men, right? This is the South. This is has a history of trying to prevent black men from gaining possession of weapons. So that is sort of the wartime fabrication, if you will. But the modern myth, as far as I can tell, really doesn't kick into high gear until the mid to late 1970s. And it appears in response to sort of an evolving Civil War memory that is increasingly coming to acknowledge both the centrality of slavery as a cause of the war, and especially the service of roughly 200,000 Black men who fought as soldiers in the United States Army.
Right.
And so it also, interestingly, I point this out in the book, the first signs of this myth appear in the wake of the popularity of the television miniseries Roots, which aired in 1977. Incredibly popular. For the first time, I think many white Americans, especially, are exposed to a darker version of slavery. In contrast to that Gone with the Wind mythology, and you begin to see rumblings in Confederate heritage groups like the Sons of Confederate Veterans. We need to protect our story. We need to protect the legacy of the Confederacy. It wasn't about slavery. Slavery was good, right? Race relations between whites and blacks in the antebellum South were positive, right? That's the lost cause narrative of the Civil War. Jump ahead to 1989 and the success of the Hollywood movie Glory, right? Think about that movie centered on the 54th Massachusetts, the first Black regiment raised in the North. Denzel Washington gets an Oscar for the Best Supporting Actor. That puts that narrative on the front page for the first time. And so you can really begin to see this narrative begin to sort of expand within, these Confederate heritage groups. But it's not until the internet that it really sort of takes off. And that's why it's so important. That's why I sort of started off with that point. The narrative, as Americans, as this memory of the war continues to shift and focus more on slavery and emancipation, you see more of a defensive posture from neo-Confederates, from Confederate heritage folks, and others who just do not want to deal with the issue of race or deal with anything that threatens the legacy of their great-great-grandparents, right? Or, again, just the legacy of the Confederacy. So it's a defensive mechanism in many respects.
So sorry for the interruption, but we're going to take a brief break now for a word from our sponsors.
Right. And can you share what your thoughts are? I know recently, so I'm in Charlottesville, and I know there's been a lot of issues here about statues and about, the statue of Robert E. Lee.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place. And
it is.
I mean, there's, and those statues, as far as I'm aware of, were put up much after, later after the war.
1920s.
And it was, and it was because there was essentially separate neighborhoods. There was sort of the white Charlottesville neighborhood and the black Charlottesville neighborhood. And it was sort of a way there was a lot more of subcontext to it than I think many people are aware of today. So what are your thoughts on the whole statue?
Yeah, I lived and taught in Charlottesville for 11 years, high school history. I used those statues, in my Civil War class, taking my students downtown to those two squares and other sites in and around Charlottesville to talk about, the difference between history and memory, right? How those statues reflect how Americans have remembered the Civil War at different points in time. And of course, tomorrow is the 5-year anniversary of, tonight I think is the anniversary of the march on the UVA campus, but tomorrow, of course, the violence in downtown Charlottesville. I remember watching it live and seeing some of my former students in the crowd of the counter-protesters. And those statues, as you rightly point out, helped to do the work of segregation in places like Charlottesville. Same with Monument Avenue in Richmond. When those monuments went up, they were advertised by real estate companies as places for white families to build new homes in this brand new neighborhood. And if you look at many of the ads, they actually say they have the restrictive clauses that no lots will be sold to people of African descent. In Charlottesville, what's interesting is the Stonewall Jackson Equestrian Monument, which I think had some artistic merit, was actually placed in a neighborhood that was at one time a black community, and so they did that work of displacing African Americans. Look, I think the reckoning that we've seen over the last few years is long overdue. I think that we need to do a much better job of acknowledging the fact that these monuments have always been controversial. It's just that for some people, they've never had a voice to actually bring about change. It's unfortunate that it took the kind of racial violence that we've seen over the last few years to sort of make this happen. So I understand why many of these monuments, memorials, and statues have come down or have been relocated. I think, the monuments went up because locals wanted them up, and our public spaces reflect what we take to be our shared values. They should be places where everyone can look at, embrace as their own, as representing who they are. And when a monument or anything else that's placed in a public space makes you feel as if you are less than welcome or less than a full citizen, especially where many of these statues are located in front of courthouses, where where you used to go to vote, you seek justice, right? It's absolutely important that we find a solution for these statues, and I think it can be an incredibly painful one. I think, especially for white Americans who may never have thought twice about having a Robert E. Lee statue a couple blocks from their home, and then having to listen to others who have always thought that they represent racism, white supremacy. And that can cause a great deal of defensiveness and feelings of discomfort. So I hope these conversations continue, and we find ways to transform many of these landscapes.
It's interesting that you talked about the difference between history and memory, because Lynn has always, I found, so I've only recently, in the last couple of years, gotten into the public history world. I was always a little bit of a buff, but never really involved directly. But Lynn's always gotten on my case about being so enamored with just the exploration of historiography. Because that is what has enamored me the most as I stepped into this world. It's like sort of like the evolving impressions of the past and how they change over time. And Lynn basically yells at me and says, "Listen, as soon as you say that word, everyone stops listening to you."
Well, not historians, but
not historians, but the average.
Everyone else's eyes glaze over, but not the historians.
They glaze over.
Historians get excited, but everyone else stops listening. But what you just said is that these statues were always controversial to a certain subset of the population. That they went up in a particular context. That's historiography. Like the understanding of that is actually essential for the public to know. Yeah. The fact that that is we are currently interpreting and reinterpreting and changing the context in which we're thinking about these things all the time.
That's right.
You have to think about it as a fluid thing versus this, because I was in school in the in the 90s, like post glory, post all this stuff, and I didn't hear explicitly about this because I grew up in the Northeast, probably mostly. That's probably why. But
same here.
The idea that black men fought in the Southern Army, in the Confederate Army, is something that I knew, quote unquote. I'm making air quotes. I knew that. I thought that was just an accepted idea. I didn't realize that it was brand new. To use the other definition of the word new, or the other word. It sounds very similar. But that it was very, very fresh in the idea and sort of solidifying itself in the public consciousness. Had no awareness of that because I was just birthed into that era. So it feels as if everything is static and so solid and so specific when you're just learning, when you have very little expertise in the area.
And I think this is also why the public discussion right now about education and history is just so divisive, because on the one side, Absolutely. I think there is this perception that history simply is a kind of timeless narrative, right? That history education is simply, the student is sort of something along the lines of a sponge, right? Sort of absorbing stories that have some kind of civic resonance, right? That bind us together in some fashion as Americans. And then on the other hand, the fact that Well, and think of David McCullough, the historian who just passed away. I mean, he was a champion of that view, right? That history has a kind of civic import, that it can function as a kind of glue that binds Americans together. This sort of what historians call that consensus history, right?
Right.
But that consensus history that is now being challenged was never inclusive, right? Distorted American history in so many ways, right? Left out so much, right? To fulfill what Americans or white Americans needed at the height of the Cold War and this sort of ideological struggle with the Soviet Union. And now, of course, people we're pushing back and saying, well, what if we look at American history not from the perspective of 1776, but maybe from the perspective of 1619? What does American history look like if we sort of look at the grassroots of the civil rights movement, right? Or immigration, the story of women, right? Which has been there for a while, but of course on the periphery. And I think that is also, I think, a fundamental. That's a rub, right? On the one, we can see memory playing out, right? That for a long time, how people wanted to frame American history for those decades is now being challenged by people who have perhaps always seen it from a different perspective, but are now finding ways to sort of introduce that into the classroom and beyond in our public discussion. I mean, that's part of what the monument debate is about, right? Those monuments no longer reflect our shared past.
Right.
Yeah, that's an important thing to understand. It's incredibly valuable. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we started this podcast. It's because certain things get weeded out when you start crafting that narrative string
or oversimplified
through history. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, and oversimplified.
Exactly.
Yeah, things are often too complicated for that simple narrative, so that they get forgotten or shaved off. But just to get back to, and this is, just to get back to your
I know, it's so
subject of your
interesting.
book.
We could go in so many tangents.
Exactly. And I'm happy to be honest.
But to get back to your book, this is a little bit of tying both of these ideas together. In the idea that something is more complicated, you talk specifically, I guess my first question, could you find soldier? Because we've talked about, hey, these people were soldiers, right? So that idea of what a soldier is an important concept for us to sort of nail down. But I did want to bring that, after we do that, I do have a way to bring it into the historiographical idea that we were just talking about.
Yeah. I mean, for the United States Army before the Civil War, the military was not, comparing it to, say, the 20th century, was certainly not a popular route for young white Americans, North or South or West, right? It was, the sort of, you may have gone to West Point, graduated, become sort of an officer, junior officer, and waited decades for promotion. The Army, I think, the size of the Army by 1860 is roughly 16,000, spread along the frontier, dealing with, of course, American expansion, and problems on the frontier with Native Americans. And so, of course, that process of becoming a soldier was the formal process of enlistment, either through West Point or volunteering as an enlisted soldier and taking that oath, signing the right papers. But it was a formal process. Jumping to the war, of course, you could join regiments through your state. You could join a couple regiments on a national level. And it was also, a similar process, right? Signing the papers, you have an enlistment paper. It's a formal process. But in both cases, we're talking about a very specific relationship between the federal government and the citizen, right? So the men who are serving in both the United States Army and the Confederate Army are what you might call citizen soldiers, right? And this is an important distinction because it helps us understand, especially for the Confederacy, why African Americans were resisted for so long until the final weeks of the war, and even why they were resisted initially in the United States Army. And that is, they weren't citizens. And the idea in a republic is that as a citizen, you have an obligation if your country needs you to volunteer, right? That is sort of part of that reciprocal relationship between the citizen, and the state, right? And then after your term of service is over, after you are no longer needed, you go back to becoming a citizen, right? And that's exactly what happens in the United States Army. After 1865, the demobilization takes place, and the Army quickly returns not to its pre-war levels, but certainly not to 2 million at its height during the Civil War. And again, I stress that it's an important point here because, especially in the South, in the Confederacy, enslaved men are not citizens. Now, they're not really citizens, or it's fuzzy in the North. The Dred Scott decision, the famous Supreme Court decision in 1857, of course, declared that African Americans could not be citizens of the United States. But they are allowed to enlist beginning in 1863. But it certainly is part of what helps us understand why in the Confederacy they are resisted for so long. Because if you make slave soldiers, then the entire architecture of the Confederacy crumbles. The entire purpose of the Confederacy crumbles. Because if you're going to make them soldiers, then you've collapsed the racial hierarchy, right? And people acknowledge this during the war. Remember, in 1864, the Confederacy engaged in a very public, very divisive debate about this very issue. More and more people, I mean, the issue had come up during the war, the question of black enlistment, but certainly a lot more people by 1864 are beginning to see the writing on the wall that if something drastic isn't done, the Confederacy's chances are over. It's going to be defeat. And so, you can read newspapers from every part of the Confederacy. Read the editorials. You can read the letters from soldiers who are following this debate, right? Who are in the Army, writing back home their views about black enlistment. You can read people on the home front. You can read the politicians in Richmond who are debating this. People like Jefferson Davis, the president, even Robert E. Lee is getting in on the action. And so the question of enlistment, it directly connects to the whole question of citizenship. And there are plenty of people who make that very specific point. If we recruit them, then what are we fighting for? The other thing that's important about the debate that I think most people forget about is, that 10 plus years of reading this stuff, not once did I come across anyone in the Army, on the home front, in the halls of the Confederate Congress, regardless of their position on enlistment of slaves as soldiers. Not one person said, oh, by the way, they're already fighting in the Army. Not one person. You'd think you'd find one person. I even had a reward at one point when I was when I was blogging. If you can find a source, there's a reward. There's a monetary reward for you. I mean, not
That's
one.
Brilliant,
right? You'd think someone would have commented, especially the soldiers in the Army. So, I mean, entire regiments are voting at this time on whether or not to allow black men to enlist as soldiers.
Right.
You'd think if they were already there as soldiers, they would have said, oh, by the way, guys, no need to debate this. It's already happening. It just wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in those debates, not this specific debate, but it's not like that question wasn't asked or wasn't simmering on the minds of people, and especially in the South, for like a full generation, because they had similar conversations during the Revolutionary War.
That's exactly right.
What do we do with these black men that we want to give guns to? Like, it would be beneficial for us to give guns to because they're fighting. They're able to fight. Can we?
That is exactly right. That is exactly right. And they're paying attention, especially after the United States begins recruiting black men into its own army, and especially once those black men are on the battlefield fighting Confederates. Right. All of this, I think, sort of lends itself to sort of the point that people who believe this nonsense just haven't spent enough time just reading the history, the basic history, right?
Right.
Again, that context is so important.
It was interesting that you were drawing it to at least some people's, wants to protect the memory that or a family memory of a great, father or that fought. I just think it's interesting even if you're thinking about that, say, because so my family is actually relatively new to the United States. I don't have any family history that goes past like 1890 here. So I'm well divorced from this from a personal level, and so I may not understand, fully acknowledging that I don't have any of that. I might be incredibly biased because I don't have that context, but. It seems to reason to think about the army and these citizen soldiers that it's easy to think of them as like these avatars for these ideological stands, but the reason someone signs some of those papers are in of themselves incredibly complicated. Like whether or not like there's all sorts of coercion and societal pressures, and even it could be economic pressures, a ton of things that drive someone to say, hey, I'm willing to put my life on the line and get paid.
Such a good point.
It's so complicated. Like if you look at, you can't think of it's easy to think of it today, right? I mean, we think about the war in Afghanistan and those things, and there's a myriad of soldiers, a plurality of soldiers that come out of veterans, that come out of those wars being like, hey, this was a mistake. There's plenty of soldiers that came out of Vietnam that like, hey, this was a little bit more. When I got over there, we may not have been, I believed the propaganda, but I don't necessarily believe what was happening. And there's no reason to think that wasn't necessarily true at the time. That there were a whole host of reasons why someone would get in. That they're not like a card-carrying member of I am a white supremacist, absolutely, and believe 100% all of these things in this book, or on this pamphlet.
I couldn't agree more with that. And I think I'll take it one step further. I think it's I think for people who do that, who engage in that, that kind of defensive, that posture, defending the legacy of an ancestor, I think they're the ones who are dishonoring their memory, right? Who are not willing to sort of face, what may have been the case or uncomfortable truths. In many cases, look, I mean, the nice thing about, if you study the American Civil War, especially if you're interested in the soldier experience, I mean, you can spend the rest of your life reading just Confederate diaries and Confederate letters alone. Forget the United States Army during the Civil War. But even with that, even granted that, in most cases, most people who claim some kind of ancestor don't have a single letter, don't have a single page of a diary to work with. They have absolutely no idea why their ancestor was in the war, whether he was, as you say, possibly coerced, drafted in the army, and what he thought at any given time, right? I mean, it's also bizarre to just sort of assume that soldiers were consistent in their thinking throughout the war.
Right.
And unfortunately, I think historians are part of the problem here. I think Civil War historians, a lot of the scholarship has been an attempt to answer the question of why they were fighting, as if there is an answer to that question, rather than looking at individual soldiers and looking at the complexity of their experience over time. I don't want to be, I didn't mean to be too dismissive of that sort of earlier question, but I do think, just to get to your point, look, man, let's be brave here, and if we're serious about this, wanting to know and understand, let's look at it, right? And let's let the evidence take us where it takes us, and deal with it, right? It's not I oftentimes feel, when I'm talking to some people, that they think it's a commentary on their own morality or legitimacy, right? I mean, look, you're not responsible for what your great-great-grandfather did, right? Well, that's my own view, right? But oftentimes people behave as if everything is
the sins of the father need to be, exactly.
I was just going to say, but I also think it points to the fact that a lot of this is not really about history. A lot of this, I think, is where history and our own culture and politics overlap, right? Quite often when I'm talking to people about the Black Confederate myth, or about the legacy of the Confederacy, I soon realize that we're not talking about history as much as we're talking about current issues, right?
Sure.
And that's part of this conversation.
Absolutely. And one of our big questions that we sort of have been keeping on the forefront of our mind in our first episode for this was, what does it mean to be an American? And sometimes it seems like even in this, with the Civil War, that it's a battle over who really belongs here, who really is an American. And so I'm just wondering, when has anybody sort of broached that topic with you, and what are your thoughts on it?
I couldn't agree with you more. I think quite often it is sort of a window into, the current cultural divide. It's quite often it's a discussion about ultimately who can consider themselves to be a legitimate Southerner, right?
Right. Oh, yes.
Quite often, a lot of this is when you're talking to people who are defending the South, quote unquote, the South, really what they're talking about are white Southerners from a specific time. And so explicitly or implicitly, this becomes a conversation about immigration, about changing demographics. It's also, I think, a conversation about, in many cases, the power of the federal government versus the states, right? It's a question about overreach on the part of the federal government. Look, it should come as no surprise that there was a Confederate flag, at least one, flown through the Capitol building on January 6th, 2020, right? 2021, right?
21,
My sense of time is like, because of COVID, so distorted. Right? There's a reason why they were, the Unite the Right rally took place in a Charlottesville park defending a Confederate statue, right? It's, or why you find them being flown, if Confederate flags being flown at, Trump rallies, right? A lot of this is about current politics. It's oftentimes impossible to see where one begins, where history begins and ends, and you start a conversation about current culture and politics. It's incredibly difficult.
Right, and it's
there's this really, really common phrase that I guess historians like to use it and stuff. That's like, history is written by the victors, right? And what's strange about the American Civil War, the more I look into it, is that it doesn't seem to be true. And when you consider the pervasiveness of things that are lost cause ideas, that it outright isn't. Like the ideological war was won, at least in part, by the folks that lost that war.
I think.
And if I could just throw in,
go ahead. Yeah, please.
I just want to throw in a quick example. I grew up in Pittsburgh, and I never in my life thought of myself as a Yankee or a Northerner. I never thought of that. And then I moved to Virginia, and I would, go to Civil War battlefields because, I was a history nerd. So I'd go to the battlefield, and people would call me a Yankee. They'd say, "Oh, you're on that side." And I literally had to take on a new identity that I am a Northerner and I'm a Yankee. And I just have to accept that in Virginia, that is part of my identity. Which was so strange.
Yeah. But of course, in Virginia now, it depends what part of Virginia you move to, right? I mean, if you're in northern Virginia, Charlottesville,
that's not even Virginia,
right?
They'll say.
I mean, Charlottesville is sort of this little island, right? Island of blue within this, broader region of red. So you have that dynamic. I do think there's a certain truth to that that this, what we call this lost cause narrative, this sort of celebratory narrative of the Confederacy, of the Confederate soldier, this attempt to sort of distance the Confederacy and the Confederate soldier from slavery and white supremacy, the idea that white Southerners were unified during the war, all of that, the lost cause, certainly, I think, enjoyed a great deal of popularity in the post-war South for the obvious reason that white Southerners were desperately trying to figure out, how do you move on from defeat, right? How do you begin to take those first steps? And it's certainly the case by the beginning of the 20th century. You can see that monument landscape take shape, the one that we're now dealing with around much of the South. That really becomes solidified and is an extension of the lost cause, but I think also, an extension or a reflection of race relations during the post-Reconstruction period into the Jim Crow era.
Right.
But I don't think we want to go too far with this, because I do think we need to leave room to acknowledge that there were other narratives, vibrant narratives that that held sway and had some influence in other circles. There was an emancipationist narrative that African Americans continued to celebrate in the South, in their own churches and their schools, and throughout parts of the North. There was a Union narrative that celebrated, I think, that's a narrative that I think has largely been lost to Americans today. And it's a narrative that I think most white Americans in the United States would have embraced. And that is the idea that the Civil War, that the result of the Civil War, the most important result of the Civil War, was not the end of slavery, but it was the reuniting of the nation. It was the preservation of the Union. And I think a lot of Americans today miss this because it's not a narrative that you can wrap your head around, right? You can understand why Southerners are fighting. If they say, well, because we're defending our homes, we're defending our way of life. That makes sense. Right. But how to understand a Mainer who volunteers in 1861 and remains in the war to the end, someone who, let's face it, comes from a place that would never have been militarily threatened during the war. Why would you be willing to give your life for Union? That concept, I think, has largely been lost. And I think that narrative held a great deal of influence by the turn of the century, the 20th century. And it's also, I think, a narrative that many white Southerners embraced. I think we also forget that white Southerners, by the early 20th century, as much as they're still embracing the lost cause, they believed that it was possible to both celebrate their failed cause and embrace a kind of new nationalism, especially as the United States was beginning to become an overseas power, right? That reunion kind of pull, if you will, was very much at work, getting people to sort of see beyond their regional differences. So that reunion narrative also, I think, is part of this. But there's no question, Isaac, that the lost cause, enjoyed a healthy life, continues to enjoy a great deal of influence in certain circles today. There's no question about that.
Yeah, that's actually a good point about the limitations of the Union narrative, the idea of preservation of the Union. And that, because even I have a hard time wrapping my head around the idea of celebrating, the disconnect between celebrating a secessionist movement and also nationalism as a it's easier to celebrate emancipation, right? And to see that as as sort of the ultimate result. Victory.
And look, I don't want to downplay that in any way. It was absolutely crucial. But most white Americans, most loyal white Americans, I think viewed it as instrumental to saving the Union. In other words, they supported recruiting black soldiers by 63, 64. They supported ending slavery because by ending slavery, you're going to more quickly end the war and you're going to guarantee a reunited nation moving forward. If you don't deal with slavery, then we're going to have this problem all over again at some point. And so certainly many soldiers who go down south, who experience the horrors of slavery for the first time, they do have an awakening. There's no question about that. But I think to see the war, the average soldier or white American generally, as committed to a kind of racial equality, I think is perhaps reflects this emancipationist narrative that we've embraced today. Perhaps it has gone a little bit too far. It's a necessary corrective to the lost cause, but I think it has blinded us to certain aspects of that wartime experience for the vast majority of the loyal citizenry.
I think that's a really good point because, we've been talking about the South, but we're making it sound like everyone in the Union wanted to end slavery because they wanted equality. And, you can't look at the Union as just this, cohesive, honorable, army against like the bad South. It really
and
so much more complicated.
The danger of doing that is how do you understand the next 100 years of American history?
Exactly.
Right? I mean, if everyone was fighting to reunite the nation and fighting for racial equality, how do you explain the end of Reconstruction at the end of the 1870s? How do you explain, the racial riots that take place in in northern cities in the 20th century? I mean, it's just impossible. Right. So we shouldn't do it. I think
acknowledging that complexity of the North is hugely important. And I would direct our listeners to an interesting conversation that is relevant to this with Dr. Marcus Nebius about the difference between slave societies and societies with slaves and his thoughts on that. And it's in another podcast episode that you should definitely listen to.
Awesome.
But we are coming up to the hour here. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
It's an incredibly interesting subject and incredibly interesting discussion. Covered a ton of stuff. Can our listeners, if they want to follow your work, obviously they can buy your book. Is there anywhere online that they can find you and keep up with what you're up to?
I do write. I have a Substack account called Civil War Memory, and I pretty much update that daily. I'm pretty good with that.
Great.
And my personal website is the URL is cwmemory.com. So you can find me a number of places online.
And can you give a quick shout out for what you're working on now that I'm excited about?
Yeah, no, thanks so much. I am closing in on completing a biography of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, who was the commander of the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, the first Black regiment raised in the North during the Civil War. And so if you're thinking you may know of him, think of the movie Glory, 1989, Matthew Broderick.
Exactly.
That's the guy. Yeah.
Great. Very much looking forward to it. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much,
Kevin.
Thanks, everyone.
That was great.
Appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the full episode of Too Complicated for History. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and if you did, please leave us a review on Odyssey, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to follow us on our social media platforms at 2C4H_podcast or check out the link in the description. This will keep you in the loop for show updates, new episodes, and exclusive content.
Too Complicated for History is a podcast from Primary Source Media. Produced by Patrick Long and Lynn Price Robbins. Edited and mixed by Curtis Fritsch. Opening theme music by Sheena Biratello.